This is part 1 of What If the Kamado Siblings Parted Ways. Link in description. I know I haven't posted in a while, but I am back and ready for more. If you enjoy this fanfic What If, then like, comment, and subscribe for more. Let's start. Branching Paths by Skyward Strike. Chapter 1, Fateful Day. How did this happen? That was all Tanjiro Kamado could think as he carried the bloodied body of his sister in his back, dragging his feet through the heavy snow as he struggled to make his way through the wintry forest. How had things fallen apart so quickly? He was just gone for a single day, off to sell coal at the nearest village so to provide for his family for the New Year's. And he'd returned to find himself face to face with most of his family violently butchered. The only one still alive had been Nezuko, the eldest sister of the Kamado family and Tanjiro's own younger sister, but even then her pulse was a faint one. As he desperately tried to move his fastest, ignoring any tire from the trip to the village, dark thoughts would begin swarming Tanjiro's mind. He was the oldest son in his family, and with father gone it was his duty to protect them. And yet, he failed. He grit his teeth, the warm tears running down his face, feeling numb against his cold skin. He should have been there for them, even if it didn't change the outcome. At least he wouldn't have failed as an older brother. Tanjiro shook his head as to try and get the negative thoughts off his mind. You can't think like that. Not now, he told himself. Hanako, Takeo, Shigeru, Rokuta. Mom, I'm sorry I wasn't there. But, he glanced over at his back as Nezuko groaned slightly, moving her head and mumbling something indiscernible in her unconsciousness. At the very least I'll save you, Nezuko, so please, hang on. The surviving Kamado brother continued to struggle his way through the snow, whispering to his sister in a mantra, "Don't die. Please don't die. Please hang on. Your older brother will save you. So please, Nezuko." He didn't even have any time to think of what exactly could have caused this whole mess. Right now both body and mind were focusing on going forward and saving his sister. Trying his best to ignore the numbness of his limbs or the burning cold in his lungs. Nothing else mattered anymore. She was all he had left. He was so focused, in fact he didn't even notice when Nezuko's head suddenly began arching upwards before she suddenly let out a gut-wrenching scream and lurched her body to the side. Tanjiro didn't realize this until the last moment as his fragile balance was suddenly thrown off, slipping in the snow and letting go off Nezuko as both of them fell several feet. For a second, Tanjiro thought that this was it. He'd hit the ground and break his body. Even if the fall didn't kill him, the cold eventually would. A pathetic way to die, but maybe a fitting one for a failure like him. Except death never came. Rather, he hit the ground hard, but had his fall softened by a thick layer of snow covering the ground. Its cold and wet embrace left Tanjiro staring up into the treetops above and the white sky above it. He barely let himself rest though as he realized Nezuko might not have had the same luck as him, especially with her being injured. He got up with a start, immediately calling out to his sister, but was met with an unexpected sight. A couple feet from Tanjiro, Nezuko now stood tall on her feet with her head hanging low, her bare feet invisible beneath the sunken snow and her bloody kimono fluttering slightly with the wind. Had he stopped for a second to avail the situation, he might have even noticed that something about her was not quite right. "Nezuko, are you all right?" the boy called out worriedly as he rose to his feet, quickly moving towards his sister to check on her. "You're hurt, you shouldn't be up. Let me carry you to two." Tanjiro never got to finish his statement as Nezuko suddenly looked up at him and he felt his blood run cold. While he'd expected to see her gentle looks and kind expression, instead he was met with the gaze of a beast. Her eyes were filled with anger, pupils slitted like that of a predator, and her teeth sharp and pointed. Before he could even say anything, she'd lunged at him, mouth opening as to try and take a bite out of his neck. Despite not fully understanding what was happening, Tanjiro still reacted, and even as he fell on his back, he managed to draw his hatchet and raise it horizontally. Managing to have it so her teeth sunk into its wooden shaft rather than ripping out a chunk of his flesh. Even with Nezuko on top of him, Tanjiro would normally have no problem handling his sister, even tired as he was. But she was clearly showcasing way more strength than she should have in this animalistic state of hers. Is that a demon? He wondered, remembering the old stories he'd been told, ones about the cruel man-eating creatures that lurked in the dark, held back only by the fierce demon slayers who stood between them and devouring all of humanity. Tanjiro had always thought this was just the kind of tale you'd tell children so they wouldn't go out at night or wander too far from home, but, Nezuko, no, that can't be. Nezuko's a human, she's always been. And yet, since young, Tanjiro's nose had always been oddly sensitive, able to pick up smells most people couldn't even imagine existed. Though he'd felt it from the moment he'd picked Nezuko up, it now took on a very different context. The smell of blood, the smell of death. But it still didn't quite add up. It couldn't have been her. There was no blood in her hands, only on her clothes, and he'd found her slumped over Rokuta as if trying to protect her. Not to mention the unknown smell he'd felt lurking about in their home. No, demon or not, whoever had murdered their family couldn't have been his sister. Tanjiro wasn't given much more time to think about it though, as he suddenly felt Nezuko's push growing fiercer, and though it might have just been his impression, he could feel her getting bigger. Her strength was growing by the moment, and Tanjiro quickly realized that he wouldn't be able to keep her at bay for much longer. He could now hear a growling sound coming from her throat, her teeth sinking into his hatchet's shaft and beginning to break apart the wood in it. With no other options at this point, he decided that his best bet would be to reach out to his sister. Were there anything of her old self still there, Tanjiro knew that she'd stop herself from hurting him. Nezuko, he called out, you gotta stop this. You can fight back against it. I know you can. Despite his pleading though, all Tanjiro got from his efforts was a slight narrowing of her eyes as if she was trying to make sense of what he was saying. Though her struggle against him didn't decrease in the slightest. He pursed his lips, his arms beginning to tremble as he felt little strength left in him to hold her back, and he pleaded with her one last time. Please. You're my little sister. You're all I have left. This seemed to reach something within Nezuko though, and she suddenly stopped pushing down on him. Her eyes widening and her struggle ceasing before realization finally seemed to hit her and tears began to flow from her eyes. Tanjiro couldn't help but to let out a smile then, realizing that his sister was indeed still there. Maybe it wasn't all lost. He'd find a way to fix this. He'd find the one who slaughtered his family, who turned Nezuko into a demon, and he'd make it all right. Nezuko, He never finished his line of thought as an unfamiliar smell hit him, a shadow suddenly being cast over him and Nezuko. He tried to say something, to react. He probably could have, but his senses failed him at the worst time. He was 1 second too slow to react as a blade suddenly cut through the air before hitting its target, and in less than a moment he felt himself suddenly splashed in the face with a warm liquid. And even though he closed his eyes, he didn't need them to guess what had just happened as the sickly smell of blood invaded his nostrils once again. Giyu Tomioka landed from his sudden dash at the demon. His sandals crunching with the snow underneath them as he almost absent-mindedly swung his katana at empty air to clean its shining blue blade off the demon blood staining it before sheathing it back into his scabbard. Only then did he glance from over his shoulder to the boy whom he'd saved, who had gone from being pressured underneath the demon to now holding its body in his arms. Looking at it with a gaze of fear and disbelief. It was a gaze Giyu had seen for what seemed like thousands of times. That of someone seeing their loved ones be killed. How could he not? It was a gaze he'd even seen in the mirror more than once. The demon was once someone important to the boy. He probably did not fully understand nor process what the girl had become. Still, it wasn't easy watching the realization come to him as he held the headless body of someone he cared about. What? He looked at Giyu almost catatonically. Why, Nezuko? Giyu turned fully to face the boy, looking at him with the slightest hint of empathy hidden in his eyes. She was someone you cared about, wasn't she? He asked him, judging from your age, a sister. Perhaps. You killed her. The boy quietly said, his eyes finally tearing up in his grief. I know it may hard for you to understand this, but she wasn't the person you knew anymore. He explained, she'd become a man-eating demon. What you saw was only a feral beast in what remained of her body. I'm sorry you had to see that, but listen to me when I say it was for the best. No. The boy insisted, looking back from Giyu to Nezuko's corpse. She recognized me. I'm sure of it. It was tricking you, trying to make you lower your guard so it could go for your throat. Giyu told him, being more than familiar with how demons acted given how many he'd hunted down. Recently turned demons will do anything to get to human flesh since they expended so much energy in the transformation process. Most times they'll aim for the jugular for an easy kill and lots of blood. While they are normally far more mindless in this state, it's not impossible for this one to have retained some of its rationale and tried to pull one over on you. You're wrong, Tanjiro then said while looking up at Giyu, and he'd realized that despite the tears still flowing from the boy's eyes. The sadness and disbelief in his expression had by then been replaced by a quiet yet seething disdain directed towards him. The demon slayer felt surprised at this kid's intensity, having initially assumed little from him, but with this change of emotions. Giyu could now see in him the same anger to drive many slayers he'd met in the past. I saw it. She knew who I am. Nezuko. She never hurt anyone. I could have helped her, saved her. But you took that away from me. She was all I had left. The checkered-clad boy would lay down his sister's corpse carefully in the snow. Looking down as a shadow fell over his face before slowly reaching out to the side into the axe he dropped earlier. You took her. Giyu closed his eyes for a moment as he took a deep breath, his hand reaching not for his katana's hilt, but rather its scabbard, pulling at the knot in his sheath to untie it from his waist. The fighting here is done, boy. Let go of that axe. There was a tense moment of silence, not a single word being uttered by either of the two, with only the sounds of the forest around them painting the scenario. Just as it started, however, it was broken suddenly as Tanjiro's grip tightened around the axe's shaft and he suddenly moved at Giyu. The demon slayer's eyes narrowed as his opponent swung the axe at him, time seeming to slow down as he took a note of the boy's expression, seeing the rage, the despair, the complete lack of fear. How sad. Giyu thought as he suddenly swung the katana, scabbard and all, to intercept and easily knock the axe off the boy's grip, much to his surprise. This boy. He spun around his sheathed blade and slammed his hilt with extraordinary strength on his target's temple. He truly has nothing left to lose. He collapsed, hitting the cold snow hard, leaving Giyu to return the sheathed katana to his waist as he sighed briefly. This whole situation had brought back some bad memories. It was far from the first time he'd seen a family butchered by a demon, but the boy and his sister, that had left a bitter taste in his mouth. Nezuko. A murmur would be heard, catching Giyu's attention as he noticed that, despite the hit in the head knocking him down, the boy was surprisingly still conscious. Trying to push himself back up despite his poor state and his grogginess. Quite hard-headed too, Giyu silently noted as he landed a quick but powerful chop on his neck, properly knocking him down this time around. You might hate me for what I've done. But even then, you'd make for quite the demon slayer. Giyu rose back to his feet, retying his katana to his waist as he silently observed the unconscious boy lying on the snow, his face staring off to the side, scrunched with pain. The demon slayer stared at his form somewhat sympathetically, only to notice what he had been looking at before being knocked out and suddenly widening his eyes in shock. Just a few feet to the side of the boy was the head of the demon, severed clean from its body at the very base of the neck. Despite having been decapitated by a Nichiren blade, its disintegration was happening quite slowly, creeping up the length of its neck towards the head. And yet, what surprised Giyu was not that the demon had managed to survive so long, but rather the tears flowing from its eyes as it watched the one that the girl had once called brother. Seeing that, a memory resurfaced for Giyu Tomioka, that of his masked master during one of his many teachings years ago. Giyu, you must remember, a demon slayer's job is not one to take pleasure in. To slay a demon is an act of mercy to the human they once were. You'll see that, when you look into a slain demon's eyes, that their shreds of humanity sometimes come to surface in their dying moments. He could almost hear Yurokotake saying. It was not something Giyu had deeply reflected upon as, even when seeing those shreds of humanity in the faces of the demons he'd slain. It was hard to feel sympathy for something that had killed and fed on humans. But this girl, maybe even because of his own past, it somehow provoked a deep-seated feeling of pity in him. The demon would seem to notice it was being watched, and silently turned to meet Gyu's gaze. He narrowed his eyes. He knew he'd done the right thing. Even with the boy insisting he could reel the demon in, this was not his choice to make. It would end up killing not only him, but others as well before it was slain. He did what had to be done, but seeing those shreds of humanity and being reminded what she'd meant to the boy struck a chord in him. A demon slayer should feel no pity for doing his job. Gyu mused, hand hovering over his katana's hilt, and yet. He silently looked away from the demon before turning away and, without another word, began walking off, leaving this Nezuko girl the little time of humanity she had left to be with her brother. In his mind, Gyu played again the night his own family was taken from him. He recalled the reassuring smile in his sister's face as she convinced him to hide away in a closet and wait things out. It was the last time he'd seen her alive, the last time he'd seen any of his family alive before they were all slaughtered by a demon. Gyu's hardened gaze stared forward, that moment of emotion sinking back into his cold blue eyes. Not once as he walked did he look back. Nezuko Kamado felt as if she was having a bad dream. From the moment she woke up she felt pain. Excruciating pain. At first she didn't know who she was, nor where she was. All she knew was one single instinct, screaming one word over and over in the back of her mind. Feed. Naturally she targeted the closest prey she could find, but it struggled against her. She tried to bite down on it, but it stopped her with a weapon of sorts. Feed, feed, feed. It was screaming something at her, but she couldn't make out what it was. It all sounded very drowned out to her, almost as if she was underwater. It all only made her angrier, starting to press down harder on the prey, trying to overwhelm it. Feed, feed, feed. She felt wood splintering inside her mouth, and started to inch closer to her prey, its struggles becoming less and less of a barrier. It hurt so bad, she needed to make it stop. She needed to feed. And that's when she noticed the terror in its eyes, and if only for a second she was able to hear his words clearly. Please. You're my little sister. You're all I have left. It all hit her like a sudden slap to the face, only 100 times harder. In a moment, she'd realized what was happening, who she was struggling against, what she was trying to do. It made the excruciating physical pain she was experiencing seem so much tamer. Tanjiro. Nezuko suddenly realized, recognizing her older brother trying to hold her back. She was trying to feed. On him. On another human. On her own brother. What had happened? The family, she remembered. Though it was only a couple flashes of images in her head, brief moments amidst the massacre, she remembered. The pale man, the screams. She tried to protect Rokuta, and then, she thought she was dead. Except she couldn't have imagined an afterlife so cruel. Oh, God, she thought, it all suddenly coming crashing down on Nezuko in that one moment. Suddenly overwhelming every instinct in her body that had been screaming her to feed and causing her to break down into tears as well. Tanjiro. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, she tried to say, but could produce nothing more than grunts and groans in her current state. Her brother smiled though, seeming extremely relieved to see his sister coming to her senses. Nezuko. He never finished as he suddenly looked over her in shock, a shadow falling over them. Nezuko tried to look too, but there was a sharp sting in her neck and then, once again, nothing. She woke up again to the sound of a heavy thud in the snow, her eyes opening wide as she watched her brother crash down on the snow a few feet beside her. Tanjiro seemed dazed, not fully able to perceive his surroundings. He had a bruise on the side of his head, though it wasn't a large one. Luckily her brother was famous for being extremely hard-headed. Regardless, Nezuko tried getting back up again to try and help her brother, but realized her entire body felt numb, and she couldn't budge a single muscle. She tried desperately to rise to his aid, but regardless of what she might try, she was unable to move from the snow. Finally, she would look down slightly, and be shocked as she realized her body was no longer there, instead now lying a couple feet from her, completely motionless, and without a head. The situation seemed completely insane to her. She was barely able to process what had happened to her family and what she'd become before being decapitated. presumably by the man with the sheathed katana in his hand who currently stood over her brother. Tanjiro grunted, trying to shakily rise back to his feet, but stopping himself halfway there as he locked eyes with his sister's decapitated head and realized she was somehow still alive. Nezuko, he murmured weakly a moment before the man landed a chopping strike to his neck and made him collapse into the ground, still facing her, but now fully unconscious. Despite wanting more than anything to protect her brother in the current situation, Nezuko was unable to do a thing. I have to help him. I have to do something, she thought, but it was useless. She was only a head, with no body to call her own. The numbing feeling that had spread over her entire body was also creeping its way up her neck, so she also quickly realized she was most likely not long for this world. She wished she could at least protect her brother before that, but not having the power to do so, she felt herself breaking down emotionally once again as she began crying. It was then Nezuko noticed that the man with the katana was staring at her, and her gaze would turn up to meet his. His eyes were so dark, oh cold. For a moment she wondered if he would step over her brother and finish her off, but then she noticed something else hidden in those dark blue eyes. Something that almost seemed like a twinge of sympathy for her, ridiculous as it might have seemed given what he'd done. No sooner did she notice this that he looked away for a moment before turning his back on them altogether and starting to walk off. Nezuko would watch as he did so, the sound of his footsteps on the snow growing fainter and fainter as he marched off into the distance before disappearing from her line of sight altogether, leaving her alone with her brother. For a moment, she was relieved to see the man wasn't intending to hurt Tanjiro, but that didn't last long as she heard a brief mutter from her unconscious brother. Nezuko. And immediately her mood was soured again. Even if that man hadn't attacked her brother, that didn't mean he was fine. Once she died, he'd be left alone in the world to fend for himself. What would he do? Where would he go? Tanjiro was always such a kind person. He didn't deserve to be left all alone like this. Please. You're my little sister. You're all I have left. She was all he had left. Even though the numbing feeling had by then crawled the whole length of her neck and was now slowly making its way up her face, Nezuko was still fighting to stay. She couldn't leave her brother alone. At best he would go on to live a sad and lonely existence, and at worst he'd chase after the one who'd done this to them and get killed doing it. She couldn't let him go on alone. Even with death ever so imminent, she did everything in her limited power to push it away. She just couldn't. Even in your pitiful state, you fight back against death. It is commendable. Nezuko widened her eyes then just as the numbing feeling reached her mouth. The voice wasn't a memory, nor was it her own thoughts. It was someone else's, something else's. Though she faintly recognized it, it felt impossible to put the finger on quite exactly where from. It had caught her completely off guard, but not nearly as much as what happened next. Her ears were suddenly assaulted by the loud distorted sound of a string instrument that seemed to scream at her. And in the blink of an eye she'd go from lying in the snow facing her brother to lying in a hardwood floor, staring at, well, it was hard to describe. It seemed like the inside of a massive house, except distorted well beyond recognition. She could see stairs, doors and corridors structured in an impossible to navigate maze, all seemingly leading everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was as if the building had been made in a world where gravity held no meaning, and out of all the strange things Nezuko had experienced that day, this was definitely up there. Before she could reflect too much on her surroundings however, she'd hear footsteps coming from behind her. She'd have turned around if she could, but being only half ahead at this point left her little option. I knew there was something special about you when I decided to gift you some of my blood. A man's voice sounded. And Nezuko felt a chill run up her non-existent spine as she realized this had been not only the same voice she'd heard in her head moments before, but also the same voice she'd heard before her entire family was slaughtered before her. Most demons will mourn or plead, some might even fall back to their pitiful humanity before death. But to so vehemently fight it, and not for their own sake, but that of another, that is sign of amazing devotion. Nezuko would feel what remained of her head being picked up then, and brought to look face to face with the man. She felt afraid as she had been when her family was killed by the same man, so much so she barely noticed the numbing feeling having stopped just short of reaching her nose. "It would be a waste to let you die like this," the man noted, staring at her with burning red eyes, seeming to almost glow with deadly intensity in the shadow of his white fedora. His lips twisted into a cruel smirk. "Consider what I'm about to give you your second chance." She would feel his fingers piercing into her head, and for the second time that day, Nezuko felt the excruciating physical pain of demon transformation as her limited body tried to adapt itself. "Nezuko!" Tanjiro cried out, waking up with a start. He sat up, panting and sweating coldly as he recalled what had happened. He looked off to the side where he'd seen his sister's head watching him, but was met with nothing but snow and ash. He looked around, searching for her body as well, but much like the head, it seemed to be completely gone. Tanjiro quickly began to panic, and tried to feel for her scent in his surroundings. He'd quickly pick up on the swordsman and was able to determine he'd gone off already, but try as he might, Nezuko's scent was only focused around the clearing where that man had attacked her. There was no trace hinting as to where she could have gone. His sister might as well have disappeared into thin air. "No," he murmured to himself, collapsing down on his knees as he realized there was no way around him where his sister could have gone off to. No, 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 no. Tanjiro looked all around him, trying to find anything, a trace, a hint of what might have happened. "Nezuko!" he soon enough screamed, rising in a stumble and starting to make his way through the forest. "Nezuko, where are you?" With no other option left, he'd keep on stumbling aimlessly through the forest, tears flowing down his eyes as he hysterically screamed out for his sister to no avail. "This can't be happening," he'd think to himself as he screamed his sister's name. "I saw her. Nezuko was still there. I could have saved her. I might have failed everyone else, but I know I could have saved her." This would go on for what seemed like forever. Despite having grown up playing in that forest nearly every day, Tanjiro had no sense of direction at that moment. His feet moved by themselves, his only focus being to try and find something, anything of his sister. It would be hours, or maybe just minutes, but Tanjiro would eventually trip on the root of a tree hidden underneath the snow in his reckless stumble, falling back down on the snow face first. His body insisted he stay down, begged of him even, but he refused to comply and attempted to rise to his feet, only to stop halfway as he realized where he'd wandered back into. Just ahead of him was the house he'd lived his entire life in. Its doors opened to reveal the carnage inside, with his siblings' bodies strewn in and around it, blood painting the walls in a sickly shade of red. He'd seen that scene before, but while shock and panic had overwhelmed him last time, now he was able to properly perceive everything he was seeing. The smell of carnage seemed to finally hit him again, and this time Tanjiro felt it. He immediately vomited on the ground, collapsing entirely on all fours. He cried hysterically, fully aware now that everyone was gone. His family was dead. Nezuko was dead. Whatever semblance of hope Tanjiro still held onto was now dead as well. He broke down entirely, cursing how useless he was, how he'd let them all die as his fingers dug into the ground underneath the snow. He screamed, as loud as he could for as long as he could, knowing there was no one around in the mountains to hear him, but entirely uncaring if they did. Time seemed irrelevant to him, so Tanjiro didn't know how long he stayed there weeping, cursing himself and overall grieving for the loss of his family. For all he knew, he might have just stayed there until the cold got to him and he ended up joining them. But he didn't, if only because, before he ever could give in to his misery, something brought him out of it and back into reality as he felt a hand be placed on his shoulder. Tanjiro paused for a moment, shocked since he hadn't smelled anyone approaching him, before looking off to the side where a stranger now stood beside him. His palm still resting gently but firmly on his shoulder. It was a man, wearing an orange kimono and a red haori over it. He was old, undoubtedly so, evidenced by the countless wrinkles in his face, his long white hair tied into a ponytail and his milky eyes having probably lost most of its vision. Yet the most notable feature of him, Tanjiro noticed, was the odd flame-like marking stretching from his temple to over his eyes and his forehead. The stranger might have been older than anyone the boy had ever met, and yet at the same time, even in his broken state, he couldn't help but to be momentarily awed by his overwhelming presence. Whoever this was, he was no regular old man. I am sorry for your family, young man, he said with sincerity, staring at the carnage before them sorrowfully, but do not fret. I will help you bring justice for what happened today. Tanjiro was speechless, not knowing even how to react. In his shock, his crying had ceased, and despite all the questions swimming around in his mind, he could only muster the one that seemed to matter the most in that moment. Who are you? The old man turned to look at him, and flashed Tanjiro a sad smile. My name is Yorichi Sugikuni, he said, and I will be mentoring you from now on. End of part 1. Hope you enjoyed this fanfic. What if, and if you d8d, then like, comment, and subscribe for more. Peace out.